Every vanilla bean on every shelf in every grocery store on the planet was pollinated by a human hand. Not a machine, not a bee. A person using their fingertip and a tiny wooden stick, pressing two microscopic parts of a flower together in a gesture that takes about 3 seconds. And that gesture repeated billions of times across the farms of Madagascar and Indonesia and Tahiti traces back to a single moment in 1841 when a 12-year-old boy on a tiny volcanic island in the Indian Ocean figured out what the greatest botanists in Europe could not. What nobody knew at the time was that this boy, born into slavery, orphaned at birth, would solve a puzzle that had frustrated scientists for 3 years, and he would never see a cent for it. But this story does not start with that boy. It starts with an orchid in a jungle and a love story, told by the people who first gave vanilla to the world. Deep in the tropical lands along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the region now called Veracruz, a vine grows unlike any other plant in the Americas. It crawls up the trunks of tropical trees, sometimes reaching 30 meters into the canopy, with thick waxy leaves and pale green flowers that bloom for just a few hours before they wilt and die. This vine is Vanilla planifolia. It belongs to the orchid family, and it holds a distinction that no other orchid on earth can claim. It is the only orchid that produces an edible fruit. Those long, dark, slender pods you see in the spice aisle, the ones that smell like birthday cake and warmth and childhood, those are the fruit of this single species. And for thousands of years, only one group of people knew how to grow them. The Totonac people of the Veracruz coast were the first to cultivate vanilla, carefully tending to these orchid vines in their shaded tropical forests as far back as the 1200s. To the Totonacs, vanilla was not just a crop, it was sacred. They used it in temple rituals and as perfume, in medicine, and as a charm for good luck. They believed the plant was a gift from the gods, and they had a story to explain how it came to be. According to Totonac legend, a goddess princess named Zanat fell in love with a mortal man. Because the gods forbade their union, because a deity could not walk among men, Zanat transformed herself into a vanilla vine so that she could stay on earth. Every year, the vine would flower and produce fragrant fruit, a reminder of her love and sacrifice. The Totonac people treated the orchid with the reverence that story demanded, and for centuries, their relationship with vanilla remained quiet, local, and unknown to the wider world. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1427, the Aztec Empire, expanding outward from its capital at Tenochtitlan in the Central Highlands, conquered the Totonac people. The Aztecs quickly developed a taste for what they found growing in the Totonac lowlands. They called vanilla tlilxochitl, which translates to black flower, a reference to the way the cured pods turned dark and shriveled, and they immediately found a use for it that would change vanilla's destiny forever. The Aztecs began mixing vanilla with cacao beans, ground corn, chili peppers, and honey to create a drink called zocolatl. If that word sounds familiar, it should. This was the ancestor of hot chocolate. But zocolatl was nothing like the sweet milky drink you know today. It was bitter, spicy, frothy, and intense. The Aztecs believed it gave strength, cured fatigue, and contained divine nectar, and it was not for everyone. Xocolatl was reserved strictly for royalty, priests, and elite warriors. Common people never tasted it. Vanilla, in its very first chapter outside the Totonac homeland, was already a luxury. The Aztecs forced the Totonac people to grow vanilla as tribute, essentially a tax paid in spice to the Aztec king. Year after year, the Totonacs harvested their sacred vine and sent the cured pods up to the highland capital. Vanilla was not just valuable, it was a form of currency. And the Aztec Emperor Montezuma was, by all accounts, obsessed with it. Historical records suggest he drank dozens of cups of xocolatl every day, flavored with vanilla from golden goblets. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything that followed. In 1599, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés sailed from Spain to the coast of Mexico. He landed near what is now Veracruz, the very heartland of vanilla, and marched inland toward the Aztec capital. When Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan, Montezuma greeted him with ceremony and hospitality, possibly believing Cortés was the returning god, Quetzalcoatl. Among the offerings Montezuma presented was a golden goblet of zocolatl, the chocolate and vanilla drink that had fueled the Aztec elite for generations. Cortés was reportedly stunned by the flavor. He had never encountered anything like it. The Spanish took careful note of both ingredients, the cacao and this mysterious dark pod that gave the drink its intoxicating aroma. They named the spice vanilla, a Spanish word meaning little sheath, a reference to the pod's shape. And when Cortés returned to Spain, he brought vanilla with him. Within decades, vanilla had reached the royal courts of Europe. At first, the Spanish tried to keep vanilla a secret, hoarding the supply and mixing it exclusively with chocolate for the royal household. But secrets like that do not last. By the late 1500s, vanilla had spread across the continent. Queen Elizabeth I of England reportedly became so fond of vanilla that she demanded it be added to her desserts without chocolate, making her one of the first Europeans on record to appreciate vanilla as a standalone flavor rather than a chocolate companion. In France, the aristocracy treated it as a prized ingredient for perfumes, pastries, and elaborate confections. Apothecaries in Paris prescribed vanilla as a remedy for everything from headaches to impotence, which, whether or not it worked, certainly helped drive demand. Vanilla quickly became a symbol of wealth and refinement across Europe. The pods were so expensive that only the very rich could afford them. A single vanilla bean in 17th century Europe could cost as much as a week's wages for a laborer, and that exclusivity only added to its appeal. The French court under Louis XIV consumed vanilla in enormous quantities, flavoring ice creams, custards, and the elaborate multi-course desserts that defined aristocratic dining. Centuries later, Thomas Jefferson, after spending 5 years in Paris as the American minister to France, became so taken with vanilla that he wrote down one of the first known American ice cream recipes, featuring a stick of vanilla. In 1791, already back in the United States and serving as Secretary of State, he ordered 50 vanilla bean pods shipped to him from France, writing that they were much used in seasoning ice creams. He later served vanilla ice cream at the White House during his presidency, and guests wrote home in amazement about the frozen dessert. Jefferson did not invent vanilla ice cream, but he may have done more than anyone else to popularize it in America. Vanilla had conquered the taste buds of the Western world. Demand was exploding, and there was a problem. A very big, very strange, very stubborn problem. The vanilla orchid refused to grow outside of Mexico. For 300 years, from the 1500s through the 1800s, European colonial powers tried to cultivate vanilla in their tropical territories. They shipped cuttings to botanical gardens in Paris and London. They planted vanilla vines on islands across the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia. The vines grew beautifully. The leaves were green and thick. The flowers bloomed right on schedule. And then nothing. The orchid would flower, the petals would drop, and no pod would form ever. Imagine the frustration. Hundreds of botanists, decades of effort, entire colonial agricultural programs dedicated to cracking this mystery. And every single attempt failed. The vines produced gorgeous flowers, but not a single vanilla bean outside of Mexican soil. For a while, things actually seemed fine for the Europeans. They could just import vanilla from Mexico at enormous cost and sell it to the wealthy. That arrangement held, but the price was staggering. Vanilla was one of the most expensive spices in the world, and the supply was limited to whatever the Mexican farmers could produce. The colonial powers wanted their own supply. They needed to grow vanilla themselves, and the plant would not cooperate. Here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The problem was not the soil. It was not the climate. It was not the water or the sunlight or the altitude. It was a bee. One specific bee, the Melipona bee. Small stingless species native to Central America and Mexico, was the only insect capable of pollinating the vanilla orchid. The vanilla flower has a unique anatomy. It contains both male and female parts, but a thin membrane called the rostellum separates them, preventing the flower from pollinating itself. The Melipona bee, small enough and persistent enough to navigate this barrier, was the only creature that could push past the rostellum and bring the pollen into contact with the stigma. And that each vanilla flower blooms for a single day. In some accounts, the window is even shorter, just a few hours in the morning, before the flower wilts and closes forever. If a Melipona bee does not visit during those few hours, that flower will never produce a pod. One day, a few hours, one specific bee. That is why vanilla existed only in Mexico. The Melipona bee did not live anywhere else on Earth. I mean, think about that for a second. The entire global vanilla supply, from the 1500s to the 1800s, depended on whether a tiny stingless bee in a Mexican jungle happened to visit the right flower on the right morning. In 1836, a Belgian botanist named Charles Morin published a paper describing an artificial pollination method for vanilla. He had figured out in theory how to do what the bee did, but his technique was fiddly and slow, better suited for a greenhouse experiment than a working plantation. It was not practical for any kind of large-scale cultivation. The mystery remained effectively unsolved. Everything was in place for a breakthrough. The scientific community just did not know what that breakthrough was building toward. And then we arrive at Reunion Island, 1841. Reunion, then known as Bourbon Island, is a small volcanic island in the Indian Ocean, about 900 kilometers east of Madagascar. French colonists had brought vanilla cuttings to the island in the 1820s, hoping to start commercial production. The vines grew, the flowers bloomed, and just like everywhere else outside Mexico, no fruit appeared. The vines sat barren for 20 years. On a plantation in the town of Saint-Suzanne, a man named Feriol Bellier Beaumont tended his gardens. Bellier Beaumont was a colonist and enslaver, and among the people he enslaved was a boy named Edmond. Edmond had been born on the island around 1829. His mother, an enslaved woman, died during childbirth. He never knew his father. Bellier Beaumont took a particular interest in the boy and taught him about plants, about botany, about how flowers reproduced. He showed Edmond how to cross-pollinate other crops like watermelons and pumpkins by hand. One day in 1841, Bellier Beaumont was walking through his gardens with 12-year-old Edmond when he noticed something that stopped him cold. 2 green vanilla pods were hanging from a vine that had been barren for 20 years, a vine that had never produced a single bean. Bellier Beaumont could not believe it. He asked Edmond if he knew anything about it. Edmond told him that he had done it himself. At first, Bellier Beaumont did not believe that a 12-year-old boy had accomplished what the greatest botanists in Europe had failed to do for 3 centuries. A few days later, more pods appeared on the vine. Bellier Beaumont asked Edmond to demonstrate his technique. What Edmond showed him was breathtakingly simple and impossibly clever at the same time. He took a thin wooden splinter, a small stick no bigger than a toothpick, and approached a freshly opened vanilla flower. With one hand, he steadied the blossom. With the splinter, he gently lifted the rostellum, that tiny membrane separating the male and female parts of the flower. Then, with his thumb, he pressed the pollen mass firmly against the stigma, completing the pollination in a matter of seconds. The whole procedure took no more than 2 or 3 seconds per flower. It required no special tools, no equipment, no laboratory, just a steady hand, a thin stick, and the knowledge of exactly which flap to lift. The technique was likely inspired by what Bellier Beaumont had taught him about cross-pollinating other plants like watermelons and pumpkins. Edmond had taken that knowledge and applied it to the vanilla orchid, something nobody in the scientific world had thought to try. As one historian later put it, Edmond's invention appears disarmingly simple, but only after the fact. Before Edmond, the finest minds in European botany had stared at the same flower and seen nothing but failure. This 12-year-old boy, born into slavery, orphaned at birth with no formal education, had cracked the 300-year-old mystery of vanilla. Bellier Beaumont immediately spread the technique across Reunion Island. Within months, vanilla production on the island exploded. Within a few years, the method had been taught to farmers on Madagascar, the Comoros Islands, and eventually across every tropical region where vanilla vines grew. For the first time in history, vanilla could be cultivated commercially outside of Mexico. Slavery was abolished on Reunion Island in 1848. Edmond was freed and given the surname Albus, but freedom did not bring prosperity. Edmond Albus struggled for the rest of his life. He never received any compensation, any recognition, any financial reward for a technique that had unlocked a global industry. On August 9, 1880, Edmond Albus died in a public hospital in Saint-Suzanne at the age of 51. It was a destitute and miserable end. The hand pollination method spread from Reunion to Madagascar in the 1850s and 1860s, and Madagascar's northeastern coast turned out to be paradise for vanilla orchids. The Sava region had the perfect combination of tropical heat, humidity, and rainfall. By the late 1800s, Madagascar had become the dominant vanilla producer on the planet. Today, that single island nation produces roughly 80% of the world's bourbon vanilla supply. Roughly 70,000 smallholder farmers in the Sava region grow vanilla on plots smaller than a hectare, tending the vines by hand. Every single one of those farmers, every morning during pollination season, walks through their vanilla orchards at dawn and performs the exact technique that Edmond Albus invented in 1841. The same gesture, the same thin stick, the same 3-second motion. His discovery has never been improved upon. It has never been mechanized. It has never been replaced. But vanilla's story did not end with Edmund. Chemists in Europe were working on something entirely different. In 1874, Ferdinand Tiemann and Wilhelm Harman figured out how to synthesize vanillin, the primary flavor compound in vanilla beans, from coniferin, found in pine bark. Today, over 85% of all vanilla flavoring consumed worldwide is synthetic vanillin, most of it derived from petrochemical precursors. Natural vanilla beans contain over 250 individual flavor compounds that together create the complex taste profile we associate with real vanilla. But synthetic vanillin replicates the dominant molecule cheaply and at scale. It made vanilla flavor accessible to billions of people who could never have afforded the real thing. It democratized a taste that had been reserved for royalty for centuries. But in applications where vanilla is the star, the full complexity of natural vanilla beans is irreplaceable. This is why the market for real vanilla beans has never disappeared. Vanilla is the sixth most expensive spice in the world, right behind saffron, and its price is staggeringly volatile. By 2018 vanilla beans hit over $500 per kilogram, making it nearly as expensive as silver by weight. The volatility has real human consequences. When prices are high, vanilla becomes a target for theft, and farmers in Madagascar have been attacked and killed for their vanilla crops. And through all of this, the fundamental process has not changed. The vanilla orchid still takes 3 to 4 years to mature. Each flower still opens for a single day. Each flower still must be pollinated by hand. After pollination, the green pods take 7 to 9 months to mature on the vine, and then the curing process begins. Curing vanilla is an art form unto itself. The green pods are briefly blanched in hot water, wrapped in dark cloth to sweat, and laid out in the tropical sun during the day for several weeks. The full curing process takes 6 to 9 months. Roughly 6 to 8 kilograms of green vanilla beans are needed to produce a single kilogram of the finished ready product. From the moment a farmer pollinates a flower to the moment a cured vanilla bean reaches a store shelf, more than a year has passed. Every step done by hand. So when people use the word vanilla to mean plain, boring, or ordinary, they are accidentally using one of the most ironic expressions. There is nothing plain about vanilla. It comes from the only edible orchid fruit on earth. It was sacred to an ancient civilization and stolen by an empire. It stumped the finest scientific minds in Europe for 3 centuries. Its commercial existence depends on a technique invented by an enslaved child who died in. It is pollinated by hand, one flower at a time in a window of a few hours once a year. Vanilla is not boring. Vanilla is one of the most extraordinary flavors that has ever existed. The next time you taste vanilla, remember that what you are experiencing is the end result of a chain of events stretching back 1,000 years. And at the center of that chain, a 12-year-old boy, with a thin wooden stick, pressing 2 tiny parts of a flower together, and changing the world in 3 seconds flat. What endures from vanilla's story is not just a flavor. It is Edmund Albus, whose name should be famous, but is not. It is the 70,000 farmers on Madagascar who still wake before dawn to pollinate flowers by hand. And it is the orchid itself, fragile and stubborn and impossible, still blooming one day a year, still demanding that someone show up in time,